All right. Well, hey, friends, welcome to God on. Nope, this is not God on Tap. I do that every time. You know what? I usually hit stop and then I re record. This is just Tap. God on Tap is my podcast and one I have not filmed in like a year, so I don't know why I always say that. But this is TAP, which stands for Theology Automatic for the People. I am Nika Spalding, and I have the privilege of being the resident theologian at a church called St. Jude Oak Cliff. And if you're just now joining us, we're so glad you're here. And for everyone else, it's fun to press on. Today, we are going to be looking at the story of Ruth, which I'm really excited about. And I actually preached on Ruth not that long ago, just like maybe a couple of weeks ago. And so, so if you're interested in more of Ruth when we finish here, I'll figure out the day. I'll put that in the email or something. But anyways, I just love the story of Ruth. And so that's what we're going to look at today. As usual, anytime we study anything that has to do with theology, anything through the scriptures, the study of God, or anything like that, we always want the goal of our instruction to be greater worship of God, greater love of God, and then greater love of our neighbor, greater love of the Trinitarian God. And so to that end, we always begin with worship because we want to have our goal in mind as we set our hearts right on things of the Lord. So read through Psalm 119, verses 9 through 16. The Psalm 119 is one large, what are those things called? Acrostic poem, acrostic, where each letter, so like the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, and all these letters. And so the Psalm 119 is actually arranged that the first 8 verses all start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Aleph. And then this one is the second letter, Bet, or Beth, Bet. And so anyways, super interesting in the Hebrew what they did there. So I just free little info for you there to nerd out about. So go read that, hit pause, spend some time in that passage. Psalm 119 is an incredible psalm all about how there is reward and goodness for those who would meditate on God's law. So push pause, go read that. What are some of your takeaways? What do you notice about God's word and God's purpose in giving it to us? All right. So now we're going to talk about Ruth the Moabite. So you can find this passage in Ruth, go figure. And so Ruth is 4 chapters, small little book. It is tucked in right behind the book of Judges. And the gist of the story, okay, so just high level 30,000 foot view, is there's a young widow who, rather than returning to her family, she clings to her mother-in-law, a woman named Naomi. And instead of returning to her father's house, we know that as far as outsiders go, that Ruth is a widow. She's a foreigner. When they return to Israel, she will be a foreigner. She'll be from Moab. She's going to be poor because if you're a female and you're a widow, you're pretty much going to be poor. But also because we just know that from the text, she doesn't own any land or any of that. And she's a woman. So vulnerable upon vulnerable. Sounds a little bit like Rahab, doesn't it? Like as we went through the Rahab story, you're like, she's a prostitute, she's a foreigner, she's a woman, right? All these sort of strikes, they shouldn't be strikes. These are all perfectly fine things to be. They shouldn't be strikes, but in the ancient world and even today, these are things that would add to the vulnerability of Ruth, and that would make her an outsider in ancient Israel. After she returns with Naomi, she courageously goes to a field to glean and meets Boaz. I say courageously because gleaning in the ancient world was dangerous. Women were often assaulted. And we even see, interestingly, like in this story, we see Boaz going, hey, stay near my girls, and I have instructed my guys to not mess with you, right? So there's even this presumed danger that Boaz is trying to mitigate as we come upon her and Boaz. She basically proposes to Boaz. We'll get to that. It's adult, and he's shocked by her faithfulness. He has been shocked in the story by her faithfulness, but this moment, he is especially shocked by it and her faithfulness to Naomi and her kindness to him. Specifically, he's like, you could have gone after younger men, and so we don't know how Boaz is, but we always kind of think of this story. I think sometimes this story is like this like romance story of like waiting on your Boaz, and God will bring you a Boaz, and I'm like, first of all, Boazes are lucky if they bring you a Ruth. So we need to like really like flip the script here. They're both honorable, but I'm just saying, you know, it shouldn't always be the woman waiting on this guy. Guys need to be waiting on incredible women like Ruth. But anyways, I don't think it's like this Disney story either. I think Ruth is probably a fairly young woman, and I think Boaz is probably significantly older in stuff that maybe we would even cringe at, except that we see how beautiful this story is. They do eventually get married. They have a baby. So I named this Wedding Bells, Baby Cries, Jesus Ties. And then we see a genealogy at the end. And that, of course, ties into Jesus. And so this is a super dope story, y'all. It is like It's one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. And part of it is because compared to like every other story, it's like relatively peaceful. There's a book that I'm reading called Faith of the Outsiders. And he says, what does he call it? He goes, it's a sea of tranquility, or a something of a tranquility of peace, or I don't know, something when he describes this story. Because, I mean, y'all know, you've been walking through the Bible with me for a long time now. The Bible is often like cringy McCringerson. And there's some cringe in this story, but it's mostly pretty faithful people, and it ends really beautifully. And that's just not something we see in the Bible very often. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about this story. Okay, so, but as usual, we got to get the background info. So despite it being a relatively peaceful book, okay, so it's going to start, there's tragedy in this book, but a relatively peaceful book. Its backdrop is anything but peaceful, okay? So, first of all, we know it takes place in the time of Judges. And if you thinking of the full biblical arc of the story of the Bible, lots of failure throughout. But if there was a book where there's actually some success, it would probably be Joshua. Like, Joshua is one of those books that you're like, hey, we're not doing too terrible here as a people. We've come out of Egypt, and we're going to go, and we failed to believe God and his promises. We had to wander in Numbers, and we have lots of failure in Numbers, like, definitely. But for the most part, in the book of Joshua, it's a book of them conquering the land. It's a pretty positive book. Well, Joshua is followed by Judges. And Judges starts well and just plummets. And it is a story of Israel's failure, and then there's somewhat repentance, and then so God restores them, and then they fail again, and it's just cycles of failure. That's the backdrop. So we have lots of failure, Israel acting completely inappropriately, and that's the time of Ruth, okay? We also know that there's a famine in the land, and that's why Naomi and Naomi's family essentially goes into Bethlehem before we even meet Ruth, because they live in Bethlehem, this is a bit of irony, is Bethlehem's called the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means in Hebrew. But there's a famine. Now, famines in the Bible are not just a big deal for obvious reasons. Like, it's obvious, especially in an agrarian culture, right? I think so many of us live in cities that we're not even aware of famines most of the time. I think we don't know how that impacts us. Like, we might, if there's a famine in some part of the world, like, we might see a price go up on certain produce products. But if you lived in a place where a famine meant you didn't eat, or you didn't eat enough, or you were in danger of not having enough for your family, that is a big deal. It's also a big deal because in the Bible, famines are often these moments where the future of the people of God are perilously close to being like taken out, okay? And so that phrase in our book of Ruth, where it says that there was a famine in the land, that specific Hebrew phrase is actually used 2 other times. In Genesis 12:10, as you'll see there, in Genesis 26:1. And then there's another famine later in Genesis as well. And so Genesis 12:10, God has just called Abraham, y'all. Like, he's like, hey, bro, come with me. Come out of Ur. I'm going to take you to the land flowing milk and honey. You're going to be my man. I'm going to give you land seed blessing. Great. And then there's a famine. And then like almost immediately, like, God has called Abraham. And then Abraham runs to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. And then the Pharaoh wants his wife, right? So already we're like, God has said that your offspring is going to be a blessing to the nations. And then Abraham and Sarah end up in Egypt, and then some other man is trying to get with Sarah. Like, whoa. Okay, so right away we have our first famine that scares us. Then we have our second famine. And this is like father, like son. Y'all, like the Bible, if it weren't just so painfully tragic, would also be, well, it is also unbelievably funny sometimes at how stupid we are as humans. Now, it's only funny when it's someone else's sin. When it's my own sin, I don't think it's very funny. So I realize what I'm saying. But Genesis 26:1, Isaac does the same thing that his father Abraham has done. So there's a famine in the land. Isaac doesn't go to Egypt, but he goes to King Abimelech, who's king of the Philistines, at Gerar, however we say that. And then he gives his wife too. He's like, yeah, my wife is my sister. And then someone sees him fondling his wife more or less. And then they're like, wait a minute. And he was like, yeah, I didn't want you to know because I didn't want to die. So again, when there's famine, we're going, what choices are the people of God going to make? Then later we see that there's a famine in the land, but thankfully God has already preserved Joseph, who was thrown into a cistern and then sold into slavery and then rises up into power and then gets thrown into prison and then rises up into power again. So don't worry, God's providence is to help people through this. But at least in this third famine, the Jacob-Joseph famine, which threatens God's people, one, God has Joseph in Pharaoh's court, which saves his people, and Jacob's family never intended to stay in Egypt. They were just coming down for provisions. So anyways, but all that to say, famines, like, so we are reading the book of Ruth, and we are already in a famine, and we're just like, blah, okay? So then we learn that they're going to Moab, all right? So Moab, not the best beginning. So if you don't remember Moab, what happens here? Go all the way back to Abraham's story. Abraham had a nephew named Lot. Lot chooses to live in the area of Sodom. He gets taken off by these rebel kings. Abraham goes and saves him. Lot continues to live in Sodom, and then, as you know, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great that the Lord, or angel of the Lord, or whoever that is, I'll let Emily debate with you guys who that is, goes to destroy it. Now they preserve Lot's family, or they try to preserve Lot's family. Some of Lot's family doesn't want to be saved. Lot, his 2 daughters and his wife get out. His wife looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. So this leaves Lot and his 2 daughters. And then his 2 daughters choose to get their father drunk and sleep with him because they think to themselves, there's no other way that we can procreate and have offspring. And remember, this tells you however desperate you have to be to sleep with your own father tells you how big of a deal offspring was in the ancient world, right? So these daughters of Lot, like, they really want sons, and that's, again, guys, it's better to be a eunuch, okay? But anyways, they sleep with him, and we learn that their sons are Moab and Ammon, who of course become the Moabites and the Ammonites. Not good history. These people are the enemies of God pretty much from this point forward, okay? So God has graciously spared these women's lives. Then they choose to sleep with their father and get pregnant, and then they have the Moabites and the Ammonites that come out of this decision. Then, okay, so that's their beginning, all right? So you as a people group were born out of incest. Not exactly your favorite way to begin a story. And then it gets worse because in Numbers 22, the Israelites have come out of Egypt, and they haven't yet made it into the promised land yet, and so they're camping in and near Moab, and the people of Moab don't really like this, and so they get their leader to try and get Balaam to curse the people, okay? And this is a hysterical story where Balaam is like, okay, great, and the whole donkey thing and all that, and he can't curse them. Like, he's like, I'll do it, but every time he opens his mouth, he speaks blessing over the people. Hilarious, okay? But already, it's like, the Moabites, not good to try and curse the Israelites, which, by the way, they're your family. Like, those are your Abraham, your uncles, whatever, your dad's uncles, like, their family, but it's fine. Then in Numbers 25, the Israelite men participate in the Moabite religious practices with women, which led to judgment. If y'all remember from our Rahab story, when I said that, hey, what happened in Shittim was not good, this is that story. These are those people. So again, started with incest, then you try to curse the Israelites, then you slept with all the Israelite men and got them into some serious judgment from the Lord. And then in Judges 3, Moab oppresses Israel for 18 years. Okay, so Moab's history, not the best, right? And Ruth is called the Moabite. And then, if y'all remember in Deuteronomy 23, which says this is who cannot come into the house of the Lord. Remember, it starts with the eunuchs. Surprise, surprise. Ammonites and Moabites aren't welcome either, okay? Now, remember, when those prohibitions are given in Deuteronomy, they were obviously never going to be forever prohibitions, because we see that the eunuchs are welcome and we see that there's freedom in, right? Remember that's because the Moabites and the Ammonites are enemies of God when that Deuteronomy passage is written, okay? But it tells you, here's the background info, right? Okay, so if that's all the background info, taking all of that, what we learned about the judges, how they're just failing constantly, what we've learned about, I gotta go back and remind myself what we're talking about. Famines. So the judges, strike 1, famine, strike 2, Moab, strike 3, okay? And just our background info, And then let's say we knew all this stuff, and then we get to Ruth, and this is Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Y'all, this book could not start any worse. Like you're reading this and you should be like, sure. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? I mean, the people during the time of Judges are just utterly in rebellion. There's a famine, which tells us every time people like run from a famine, they go somewhere else, bad things tend to happen. You tend to lose your wives, or you tend to lose whatever. And where are you going? Moab? Sure. Why not? Why not go to Moab? What could possibly go wrong in Moab? Okay, so this is how this book starts. Which you expect it to be awful when you finally meet Ruth, right? But it's not going to be awful. Okay. So here's Ruth's story. After all that background info, we don't like the Moabites. We think they're trashy people. We know that the judges is not good. We know that famine's not good. We expect there shouldn't be a Moabite hero. I'll just say that based on all that background info, okay? So, boom. Ruth's story begins. Catastrophic loss. Naomi goes into the land with her husband and her 2 sons. She loses her husband. Her 2 sons are able to take wives, which yay. And then the sons die. And so Naomi is left as a widow with just daughters. Okay? And you don't want daughters in the ancient world if you're a widow. You want sons. And that sounds tacky, but that's just the way it was. And so because women, again, had no ability to own the land, no ability to work, they are very, very vulnerable. I mean, they are in danger of prostitution. They are in danger of being harmed. They are in danger of starvation. They are in so much danger right now. So Naomi turns to her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she says, go home. Go home to your family, and she says, go home to your gods. And it may be God or gods, but basically like your Moabite religion is yours. Go home. You will have better chances there than if you return with me to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. Orpah returns, which is not a fault of Orpah, right? Orpah is making a sensible decision. It's not that she did something wrong here. It's that Ruth shows unbelievable loyalty here. And we all know that passage in Ruth. If you're familiar with Ruth at all, then you know this passage because it says, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And she says, Yahweh, deal with me. She calls on Yahweh. Here's this outsider, this Moabite, who would have had her own Moabite religions. They weren't too keen on Yahweh, right? They tried to curse Yahweh at one point, or Yahweh's people at one point, and then they lured the Yahwistic men into Moabite cultic practice. And here's this outsider calling on the name of Yahweh and declaring loyalty to him in the name of Naomi. It's incredible. It is incredible, this loyal love that Ruth exhibits here. Not what you expect from a Moabite. Not what you expect. They return to Bethlehem, and Ruth goes to glean in the fields, which is a really interesting thing that happens here. We know that in the Deuteronomy law that poor people and foreigners were not only allowed to, they were allowed to glean in the fields, but also the Israelites were expected to keep the corners of their fields from being like perfectly gleaned, so that there would be provision for people to come glean in the corners. Okay, so this is God's law being applied in a good way, which is shocking because we're in the day of Judges when no one's obeying God. So when Ruth says, I'm going to go see if I can glean somewhere, if we keep all of our background info there, we might be thinking, good luck. And she's a young foreign woman. This is dangerous. This is dangerous what she's going out to do, but she's going to do it because she needs to provide for her and Naomi. And then the text tells us she just happens upon Boaz's field, which is crazy, right? Just happens, as if God's not orchestrating every moment of our lives. So she providentially ends up in Boaz's field, who is a distant, he's not the immediate kinsman redeemer. He's not the immediate family member to Naomi's husband, widowed husband, but he's like within that family line. And we learn right away, Boaz is introduced to us as a man of honor, a noble man. And so she just happens to end up in his field. Go figure, because God is good. And so he protects her, he provides for her, he shares his lunch for her. And at the end of her gleaning, she comes home and she's got like a major amount, because he made sure that they would throw bigger stocks for her to be able to glean a significant amount. So all of a sudden, Naomi, who has been grieving, I mean, just grieving catastrophic loss, sees some hope, right? She comes back from Moab and tells everybody, don't call me Naomi, because that Naomi has a positive spin of a name. She says, call me Mara, for I'm bitter. And yet then when she sees Ruth's haul, she suddenly has a glimmer of hope. It's beautiful. I mean, she's starting to come out of this grief. She's seeing that God has not completely abandoned her. And so she realizes what's going on. She was like, I was in Boaz's field. And Naomi's like, oh, okay. So they come up with a plan. This is a sticky part of the Bible, okay? So I'm just going to tell you what I think's happening. I'm not going to make any moral judgments on it. And I don't think that it is, I think it is descriptive, not prescriptive. And what I mean by that is if you have a young daughter who has a crush on a boy, I do not believe this story is a prescription on how a woman should secure an engagement. I just think it's a description of what happened. All right. Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor. Now, it was during the harvest, which is historically a time of great revelry and excitement because you're bringing in, your harvest. It's good. You've had a good crop. Men would have often slept on the threshing floor to protect their investment. So chances are Boaz might be a little drunk or a little inebriated, and he's sleeping on the threshing floor, and Ruth sends Naomi there. And the text is suggestive. Like she's like, cover me with your blanket is a very suggestive thing that's happening here. So I'll just say it seems as if Naomi has encouraged Ruth to go and offer herself sexually to Boaz. Okay. And so, yeah, so that's what I think happened here. And Boaz, because he's an honorable man, says, gosh, this is a really kind thing you've done to Naomi and a very kind thing you've done to me, because there are a lot of young men who are more vigorous than me, which is why we think Boaz might have been very old. And he says, I will do what you're asking of me. Don't worry. So in the morning, he gives her more barley, sends her away, and he says, I will take care of it. Okay. So again, descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm not making moral judgments here, whatever. So Boaz immediately the next day goes to the proper channels at the city gate is where business obviously takes place. And also Boaz tells her, like, hey, he calls her an honorable woman. He says, don't worry, Ruth, I will make sure everyone knows that you are an honorable woman, and which is the same way that Boaz is introduced to us in this story. And it's what Emily was referencing the other day in the Proverbs 31 woman, a woman of noble character, a woman of valor. Boaz is a man of valor. And at this scene where she is basically sexually propositioning Boaz, and more than that, she's telling him, like, redeem us, like, let's make this happen. It is not just sexual, it is covenantal what's happening here. And I don't want to miss that. It's not like she's asking for a one night stand. There's an implied behind that, like, redeem us. And it's bold and it's brave and maybe a little foolish, but in the ancient world, like, women have to do, like, it's not unlike Tamar dressing up like a prostitute to sleep with Judah. And we go, oh, I don't like that. But and yet God calls her righteous. And here's Boaz saying, you are a righteous woman. You are a woman of valor. Okay. So it's not like I want to clarify. She's not looking for a hookup. This is not sexual in the sense of like lust. This is sexual in the sense of, I know what it means for us to be redeemed, and it will be covenantal marriage, sexual ties. Okay. Moving forward. Boaz goes to the gate. He presents it to the first kinsman redeemer, and we gasp and wait. Okay. This story, unlike almost every other story in the Bible, is going swimmingly. I mean, awful beginning. Awful beginning. And then Ruth clings to her mother-in-law, and then they come back to Bethlehem, and then Ruth happens upon Boaz's field, and then Boaz is kind to her, and then she goes to the threshing floor, and he says, I will do it. And it's like this incredible story. We're like, please let it have this beautiful ending. Let Ruth and Boaz come together, and let Naomi be saved, and let the names of Naomi's dead husband and sons continue on as a redeemer comes in. So Boaz goes to the first redeemer, the one who has the first right of refusal, and he's like, do you want to redeem me? He's like, yeah. And we should be going, oh, no, this is not how this should be going. So we gasp and we wait. And then he says, okay, but you're going to have to take Ruth. And he's like, nah, never mind. And now we have our sigh of relief. It's like, oh, good. Get out of our way. Do not mess up this perfectly good story. Then Boaz redeems them. Cool. They get married. They have a baby, which, as y'all know in the ancient world, big stinking deal. And then the baby, we find out, is in the lineage of King David. And it's awesome, right? And King David has a grandson you might have heard of. His name is Jesus. If you haven't heard of him, let me introduce you to him. And so here's the genealogy at the end. It says Naomi has a son. Naomi has a son, which is interesting. And they named him Obed. And Obed's the father of Jesse and the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Okay, so hold on to that name, Perez, because I'm going to come back to that. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, that was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David, who y'all have heard of. And he has a famous grandson named Jesus. Incredible story. And we're done. Like, we don't even have to, we're like, oh, it ended. It ended really beautifully. Yay, 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 yay. Everything's good, okay? So what? Okay, right? So what's the big so what for this? If you go back and you look at this story, look at how many times they call Ruth the Moabite. It's interesting. I mean, we learn that she's from Moab, but it's not like we're going to confuse her with another Ruth in the story. Why do they keep, like at the end of chapter 1, they're like, she's a Moabite. It says, then Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth, the Moabitess. No kidding. Like, we know that. We're only a few chapters in. And then it says, now Naomi, blah, 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 blah. And then Ruth, the Moabite, says to Naomi in chapter 2, blah, 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 blah. And then Ruth, who, by the way, she's a Moabite. Okay, so if you go back and read it, we learn over and over again that Ruth is a Moabite. Why do you think the author's doing that? Why do you think the author why did the author tell us 5 times that he was an Ethiopian eunuch? Why is the author telling us over and over again that she's a Moabite? I'm not going to answer this. We're going to answer this as a class, but I want you to think on that. What do you think's happening with this? Why do you think that keeps happening? Next, so what? Ruth just happens into Boaz's field? Yeah, right. What does this reveal about God's providence? This is one of those books like Esther and other books that we don't always have to see God show up in order to know that he's moving. We don't always have to see God in the story to know that it's providentially him moving people. And if you go back to when I preached on Ruth, one of the things that's so astounding about this story is in the middle of the judges' rebellion, God, on a microscopic scale, with Ruth and Boaz, is orchestrating their future salvation. So the very people who are rebelling in the book of Judges, who are doing what they seems right in their own eyes, they're rebelling from God. God is simultaneously, providentially moving in the lives of these people. Okay, sorry, I had to stop that because my battery's going to die. So anyways, we were talking about providence. Yes. Providence is important. So this is one of the so whats, is that God is at work even in places that you don't expect him to be. And he's working out good, even for people who are rebelling from him, like the people in Judges, like the people in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Israel and all over. And so sometimes it's really hard. I bet if you were living in Israel during the time of Judges, it would be really hard because of all the rebellion and all the sin to see that God is providentially at work for good. So Ruth is an incredible reminder that God takes the most unlikely of persons. Ruth, a Moabite, and we're clear about that because they definitely are going to tell us over and over again, a widow, a foreign woman, because she's a Moabite, she's poor, she's a woman, right? So you're in the book of Judges, you're crying out to God, saying, help us. What's your plan? Do we have a future? And God is building you a future better than you can understand with a Moabite widow. When people say God works in mysterious ways, this is I think part of what people mean by that, or at least what I mean by it when I say that. And so, yeah, it's an incredible story of God's providence. So my encouragement is even in the moments when we can't see God working, global pandemic, catastrophic loss, things are really hard, God is still wanting good for his people. And he often moves in ways that we can't always discern, but that doesn't mean we can't trust that he is good and working on our behalf, as evidenced by this story and countless others in the scripture. Okay. Y'all know how we talk about how names matter in the Bible? Y'all, this has cracked me up since I learned about this years ago, but it, for whatever reason, is really tickling me today. Okay, so the guy who could have redeemed Ruth, the one who almost ruined our perfectly good story, when Boaz goes to the city gate, he's like, hey, come over here. And it's Poloni Almoni in the Hebrew. It's like, I'm not even sure but it's like a kind of a play on words. And it's a phrase that can be like such and such, or as the net translates it, like, come here, what's your name? Let's see, what this is NIV. NIV translates it. How do they translate? It says, they say, come over here, my friend. Nah, that's not that good of a translation. So the whole point being, he doesn't get a name. And not only does he not get a name, like he gets nothing. Like, my friend is too nice of a translation. He's like, hey, such and such, come here. Which is interesting because it's in a chapter where lots of people are named. Naomi's named. Boaz is named. Ruth is named. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, whose honor is being restored in this moment, he gets named. Who else gets named? Lots of people get named. I mean, we go out and, Elimelech, Kilion, Mahlon, Naomi's sons get named. And then we go to the genealogy of David. Lots of people to get named. This guy, Poloni Almoni, doesn't get named. He has the chance to redeem Elimelech's property. And he's like, yeah. And then when he finds out the property comes with this Moabite woman, which we don't know, there's not enough detail here to figure out why he did that. Okay, so what we do know is when you redeem, so we learn this from the Tamar story and others. When a family member dies and a kinsman redeemer comes in and takes on the wife, the widow of the dead husband, the offspring carry on the name of the first husband. So when you see the story of Tamar is married to, so Judah has his sons. Tamar's married to his oldest son. He dies. Then Onan is the next in line. Onan sleeps with Tamar but spills his semen on the ground because he doesn't want to be the kinsman redeemer. He doesn't want his older brother's fortune to continue on with those offspring that would come out of him being fertile with her. So, but he should have just not slept with her. I mean, don't be like, oh yeah, I understand that. No, then don't sleep with her. Don't participate in these broken systems. All that to say, this guy, we don't know why. Maybe he doesn't want his fortune, his, property, his estate tied up with Ruth the Moabite. Maybe he just doesn't want to be with a Moabite. Maybe, we don't know. And it's probably not fair to dump too hard on him, but he doesn't get named. We know Shiphrah and Puah's names. We know Rahab's names. We know Ruth's name. We know, and sometimes we know the names of bad people, but this guy, we don't even know his name, which I think is hilarious. So as usual, naming matters. And this guy, I just crack up at this story every time. More so what Ruth is a reminder that where you come from is not determinative of your future. Moab has a really ugly start and then a really ugly middle. And it's bad. I mean, those stories about, to be a people group that's born out of incest, and then to be a people group that have set yourself against Israel. But then here comes Ruth, showing us that our history is not determinative and that God rewards faithfulness and loyal love. And it's not unlike when Jesus comes on the scene and he's from a small town. He's from Bethlehem too, by the way. He lives in Galilee, right? And people are like, can anything good come from Nazareth, right? He's Jesus of Nazareth. And Nazareth's a crummy town. And that's why you have people like, can anything good come from Nazareth? And it's like, well, yeah, the greatest good that has ever been given ever in the history of the world has come from it. I think that we assign far too great a value sometimes to our cultures and too little value to what God can do through faithful people. And so let me say this. It doesn't just apply to where you're from or who your family is. It also applies to even how your future began, how your story began, how your past is. And you look at that and you say, it's really broken. Can anything good come of this? Yeah. Yeah. God can do anything. God can take Ruth the Moabite and put her in the lineage of King Jesus. You think when we're reading through the Bible and we get to that story in Genesis where Lot's two daughters are having incest and we're going, can anything good come of this? Which is a valid question to ask. And the answer is yes. Yes, good can come of this because God can redeem anything. God is ultimately Boaz. He is ultimately the kinsman redeemer. God is ultimately Ruth. He's the one that clings to us and shows us loyal love, right? God is the one who does these things. And Boaz and Ruth are called noble because they're being like God. They're being like God. They're remaining loyal in love, and they are redeeming things that have bad beginnings but bringing about good futures. It's an incredible story. These are incredible stories. So yes, you're reading through the Bible and you're like, can anything good come of this? Well, is God alive? Yes, then good can come of this. All right. Remember I told you to pay attention to that name Perez? This is just so good. The Bible is just, Okay. I've already mentioned Tamar in this story a couple of times because I likened Onan spilling his seed because he didn't want to be a kinsman redeemer. If y'all remember Tamar's story, which I preached on her last Christmas, not this last one, but the one before. I love Tamar. Oh my gosh, I love Tamar so much. So her story, like I just mentioned, so she's married to Judah. Judah, who's going to be we know that Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has 12 sons, Jacob gets renamed Israel. Joseph is the really incredible son who the story of Genesis follows, but Judah is the one in which the lineage is going to carry forward. So Judah has 3 sons. His oldest son dies, and Onan is supposed to fulfill his kinsman redeemer role. He doesn't. He spills the semen on the ground, and God takes him out. So then Judah's 3rd son's too young, and so he sends Tamar back to her family and forgets about her. Not good. We're all like, excuse me, sir. You're the lineage. You need to be doing your job. And he doesn't. He doesn't show loyal love. He doesn't show faithfulness. So Tamar dresses up like a prostitute, gets him to sleep with her, and then she has twins. And then when Judah realizes what happens, he's like, oh my goodness, she is faithful. She's more faithful than I am. Incredible story. If you remember, though, those 2 sons, guess what one of their names is? It's Perez. So there's a Tamar-Ruth connection, which, going back to Boaz, this is so good, y'all. Okay, Perez, and then, let's see, how many generations? So Perez has Hezron, so 1, 2, Hezron has Ram. Yep, Ram has Abinadab. Abinadab has Nahshon. Nahshon has Salmon. Salmon has Boaz. Okay, so 7 generations, which if you didn't know, in the Bible, 7 is a very significant number. 7 generations between Perez and Boaz. So his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Tamar. Okay, so Boaz's great-great-great-grandmother is Tamar, who is a foreign woman, who demonstrates loyal love, who goes to extreme measures to preserve the lineage, not unlike Ruth, who's a foreign woman, who is very vulnerable and on the outside, and shows up on the threshing floor and makes a sexual suggestion. These stories have a lot in common. And what's interesting is we read them, and historically we've been like, oh, Tamar, that is so wrong. Oh, Ruth, thank God for Boaz. And it's like, no. The Bible celebrates these women. And they both end up in the lineage of King Jesus, okay? So y'all, it is so good. So this might be why Boaz is not ashamed to marry a Moabite. It might be why he's like, oh my gosh, she showed up on the threshing floor. Not unlike my great-great-great-great-grandmother who dressed up like a prostitute and impregnated her father-in-law. And we don't like that, right? That feels icky, sticky to us. But yet God was moving. And these women were doing the things, the courageous, somewhat strange, but necessary things to demonstrate loyal love and courage and commitment. And they're rewarded mightily for it. Mightily. And then they're Jesus's grandmothers. It's incredible. I love these stories. So what's my so what from all of that is that the world needs both strong men and strong women. And if we only have strong men and we don't have strong women, the world is going to suffer. And if we only have strong women and not strong men, the world is going to suffer. And so when we read these stories of Tamar and Ruth, we should celebrate their strength. Not just the strength of the men in these stories, but I think that's what makes the Ruth story so delicious, is that both Boaz and Ruth are strong and honorable. They're both strong and honorable most of the time in our stories. One's weak and broken and fails, and the other one is strong and righteous, and we have this like cosmic battle between men and women. And then in this story, it's like, no, this is what happens when men and women are both strong. Good comes of it. This is the fulfillment of Genesis 1. So in the midst of all of Israel rebelling in the book of Judges, and God's like, no, I created man and woman to complement each other, and for women to be Ezer warriors, strong helpers to men. And not always in the context of marriage, but often in the context of marriage. And here it comes. And we see it in Ruth. And oh my goodness, the good that comes of that. And the ripple of good that comes of that. And the hope that's restored. And the strength that's brought about. And the future of our lives are tied to it because King Jesus comes out of this. So if you have daughters, raise them strong. And if you have sons, raise them strong. And if you have daughters, raise them to respect and nurture strong men. And if you have sons, raise them to respect and nurture strong women. And if you just are a woman, be strong. And if you are a man, be strong. And I don't mean strength as in like go pump iron or like be loud and aggressive. I mean, do the courageous, hard thing that God is calling you to. Be loving and loyal to people even when it costs you something. Cling to what is good and abhor what is evil. That is strength. Get on your knees and ask God to enliven you to do the things that God is calling you to do in his kingdom. That's what strength is. And the world needs more of it. And the world needs more of it. So go out and be strong, my friends. Final page of So What. As usual in the stories of God, insiders and outsiders are turned on their heads. It's an incredible picture of Boaz is an insider. And you know what he's doing? He's living faithfully as an insider. Right? He's not like the spies who forfeit it, or he's not like Achan or the other guys who he's living out his calling. God says, hey, the whole point of being an insider is to be on mission. And so here he is protecting this foreigner and keeping the corners of his field available. And we know that Ruth's not the only woman who gleans there. There's other gleaners there. Like Boaz is doing exactly what God has asked insiders to do. And it's a chef's kiss. You're like, yay, Boaz. And then God brings in the Moabite, and she's folded into the story. It's an incredible story. And so, yeah, y'all are getting what I'm picking up. You're picking up what I'm putting down. Okay. So then these are just questions I want us to ask as a team, because I think that this story is just so positive, and I just want to keep the good juices flowing. So when has someone surprised you with their loyalty, whether it was loyalty to you or someone else? And then how have you experienced God's loyal love in your own life? And so these are just a couple of questions I want us to answer in addition to just talking about this story. But I just love this story so much. Okay, if nobody's told you that they love you, I do. But way more importantly, God is crazy about you all. And I'm really looking forward to gathering on Tuesday and talking about this book. So grace and peace, friends.